But we're going to talk about revealing the machine. And what that really comes down to, it's a study of the rich header. And we're going to talk really and focus on the respective triage that you can do with it. And it's quite cool. So yeah, I'm George. We're both PhD candidates at the Technical University of Munich. I specialize in large-scale distributed systems and trying to figure out how to do malware analysis at a very large scale. Realistically, I focus more on dynamic and static analysis and all that fun stuff. This is Julian. He's pretty much your reverse engineering, exploit development kind of extraordinaire. He also dibbles and dabbles with virtual machine introspection. So when we start talking and getting into the weeds, I'm just going to hand it over to him, and he'll entertain you guys. So what we really want to talk about first is why are we actually here? Like, why do we actually really care? So to do that, we're going to explain the problem. Now, the problem is data. I mean, I'm sure all of you as security engineers have faced this problem. There's data upon data upon data. So if we quickly look at this, we see from VirusTotal, we're seeing about 1 million samples a day that they actually have to process. And that's a lot of data. However, that's kind of only part of the picture. It's a little bit of a false hope. Because if you look from a historical context and say you go back 300 days, that's 300 million samples that you have to analyze and process and look into. So that's a lot of data again. However, that's also another false positive because this is stuff that's already suspected to be malicious. What about the benign stuff? What about the stuff we have no idea? So if you're for a large organization, you're kind of dealing with stuff, you're dealing with a tremendous amount of stuff. That pretty much kills most of our scripts, most of our fun stuff we're working with. And so the question really comes is, when you see a sample and we start to dig into this, like how do you triage it? How do you figure out what's important? How do you find out what's interesting? How do you think stuff that's related? And really it comes down to how do you make sense out of all this data? So at the university, we developed kind of our malware zoo that really helps us with our research and figuring stuff out. And we're working on one aspect of the PE32 file, and we came across this weird, interesting bit. As we started to look at it, we saw that the documentation was really non-existent. Microsoft says it doesn't exist, so that's not cool. We found a couple blog posts from reverse engineering stuff, and that was interesting, but again, it wasn't really great because they contradicted each other, and there was errors in it. And we looked in the security community, and we're like, well, have you guys ever looked at it? And the answer was no, we couldn't find one record. So what is this field? This field's called the rich header. It's pretty much overlooked. It's a poorly understood aspect, but it has three really awesome things in it. The first is a product ID. The product ID is a unique identifier, and it usually goes to, a major object or a major corporation, or it goes to a generic library, and that's pretty informative for us. The next is it has version information, so I know exactly specifically what version was used in that. It also has the compiler flags built into it too. For when that object was created, I got the version and I got the compiler flags. And the third aspect, it has how many times the linker used that object in order to build and package everything together. So that gives us an idea. And the idea is, can we actually use it, because that's some really good interesting information, to kind of put something together and do some stuff with triage. So in order to talk about that further, we got to get into the weeds. And I'm going to hand it over to Julian because he's a reverse engineering guy, and he's going to start explaining it to you. So, Julian.
All right, thank you. So before we start talking about the rich header, I would like to sync us up to get to kind of the same level of knowledge. So I would briefly like to explain the PE32 file format and also how the typical Microsoft compiler toolchain looks like. So this is what probably everybody in this room has seen at least once in his life. So this is a conventional PE file, starting with the DOS header that dates back to the early 16-bit era that nowadays does not contain much useful information anymore. And is just the header for a program that informs the user in case he should run this binary under DOS that, hey, this is not a binary that is MS-DOS compatible anymore. The only interesting field in this DOS header, nevertheless, is the ELFA new field, which is a direct reference to the beginning of the COF header, which then in turn contains all the information that modern 32 and 64 Windows operating systems usually read. And the interesting part we're going to talk about is now the rich header right in between the DOS and the COF header that is not officially documented, and Microsoft even denied its existence several times. Now, this is the Microsoft Visual Studio compiler toolchain. I want to briefly go over it such that we see what's going on here. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you see Visual Studio with this famous green arrow start clicking button. So if you click this button to compile your code and run it in Visual Studio, then what actually happens under the hood is that Visual Studio calls a command line interpreter called cl.exe, which, according to what you fed the compiler with, either C or C++ files, invokes the correct Microsoft compiler front end, C1 DLL or C1XX DLL, which then in turn create intermediate files, which are then collected by the Microsoft backend compiler, C2 DLL, which in turn then turns them into object files that you could link together. So the last step of compilation is, well, nothing fancy here. CL invokes the linker. The linker puts together the object files and either produce a portable executable.exe or a dynamic link library. What is interesting to note here is that LinkExe actually is a multi-purpose tool. So if any of you ever touched dump bin, which is, well, the Windows equivalent to object dump, or also edit bin or libexe, which are, well, a binary editor and the library manager for Microsoft files, then what actually happens under the hood there is that they are just tiny wrappers around link.exe. So link.exe actually is the Swiss Army knife at that point. Now that we know this, we can talk briefly about the rich header, and we will actually be pretending to be a parser which is trying to get useful information from that rich header, and we will see what it contains and what these blocks that we named comp IDs are, how it is created, and also how we could extract all this information. So, as George already mentioned, the rich header is an obfuscated, undocumented part of the PE header. And one already very interesting part about the rich header is that it has been there for quite a long time. So we know that it has been there since at least Visual Studio 6, which dates back to 1998, and was then, well, one could say almost forgotten until the mid or late 2000s, where several blog posts appeared with information, most notably by Daniel Pistelli, who provided valuable insights into the meaning of the rich header, but they left the interpretation of the data you could find in there totally open. So, suppose we would like to find the information that the rich header includes, then remember that picture here. If we turn this schematic overview into a hex dump, then we have something like this. So at the beginning, marked in blue, is the classical DOS header that, as you can see, is almost everywhere 0, because it doesn't make sense to include any information in there anymore. 16-bit era is long over. Except for that field at offset 3C that I marked purple, which is simply the forward reference to the PE header, which you can see down the slide in orange. And right in between those two, marked in green, there is this rich header. And one interesting part to note about this is already that we don't have a pointer to the beginning of the rich header, but rather a pointer to the end of the data that we're interested in. So while parsing this, we're actually going in reverse direction. So what we can see there at the bottom of the header structure is in orange just some padding. Then we find a, well, magic value that will later turn out to be a checksum, starting with 1337. And by the way, this is not a header I made up. I directly obtained this file from Microsoft. It's actually the linker of the Visual Studio 2013 edition. So very lead here. And we also find a hard-coded string marked in red, rich, which indicates that this is indeed a rich header we're about to deal with. Now, if you look at this data, then you will see that its contents above the colored parts are quite entangled, or obfuscated, you could say. And, well, some of you might already have guessed it. If I take that magic value that I have in purple and use it to XOR over the rest of the header, then the values start to make sense again. At the top, you can see even more padding in orange, and another magic string magically appears, reading Dan S. And now the payload that the rich header actually contains is the blue part here, where we can see what we named comp ID blocks. One comp ID block consists of 64 bits, and we see here 10 comp ID blocks. So let's try to interpret them. We have 8 bytes per comp ID block, and what they contain is usually the following. So the first 16 bits are the minor compiler version that the compiler which created the object had. The next 16 bits are the product ID, which identify not only the compiler version, but also what the object that we're dealing with was before compilation, which is quite interesting. And then there is a 32-bit count field, which indicates how many symbols within that object are referenced by the binary we are about to compile. So this is quite abstract. If you take some concrete examples for that prod ID, then looking at this table, for instance, the current Visual Studio release 2015, if you just compile together a binary and look at what values you find in a rich header, then they are typically currently around 256. So hex 105 is currently the indicator for that we are dealing with an object that was a C++ source file before compilation, and it had been spit out by C2 DLL. And one thing you could now do, of course, is asking, hey, so we're currently at 105. What if we go back in time? So Visual Studio 2010, for instance, I gave some exemplary values here, has B4 for C++ files. And if we go back even farther, for instance, to Visual Studio.NET, so that's unofficially version 7.1, then you find values in the range of 5e, for instance. And the oldest one we were able to reproduce is actually hex 15. For Visual Studio Release 6. So that was the one back to 1998, some of you might remember, correlating to a C file. So, and if you look at this, then you could try to build up a database. And that's exactly what we tried to do, but the ranges we obtained still have holes in them. So this is actually a call for participation. If any of you has some old Visual Studio releases lying around, or even newer ones, we would be very, very interested to look at those files we named there and look what values they are able to produce for the rich header. So that's the one part about it. The second part about it is that we sometimes also observe values that are completely out of that range, outside. So we have no real explanation on that. It might be because somebody tried to forge the values in there, but it's interesting to note that there seems to be a certain correlation to major companies that Microsoft partners with. So there is a special prod ID for Adobe products, for instance, but everything beyond what we could say is just speculation. Okay, now we know what the header includes. Do you still remember the 1337 checksum? Let's look at this a little bit. So in order to explain how the checksum works, I brought a tiny Python snippet here, and I will go through it one by one such that we get an understanding of what is going on here. So the first 3 lines are basically just a library function, you could say. It's doing a bitwise rotate left operation on 4 bytes, 32 bits. So don't get the math behind it, just believe that it's rolled 32. And then there's the actual checksum calculation function, which gets 3 arguments. That is the raw data of the PE file, the net information of the comp IDs we just discussed, and also, that is very important, the offset of the beginning of the rich header, which, well, some parsers tend to hardcode, but actually is not a constant value. So if you look at the first loop, for instance, then one thing that is interesting to note already is that the checksum calculation includes the values within the DOS header, right? It simply takes the values that you can find in the DOS header, rotates them by the offset you found the value at, and then sums them up. That's what the code is doing. And what is also another pitfall at this point is because the checksumming function resides in the linker, it doesn't know the value of the ELFA new field. Remember? That was the little arrow I showed you in the beginning, so the arrow pointing to the COF header. And because the linker doesn't know yet how big the rich header will be, it simply fills in dummy values at this part and skips that in the calculation of the checksum. So this is another pitfall that many parsers do wrong. And, well, after checksumming in DOS header, we find that it actually checksums the contents of the rich header, which is just, well, putting together the product ID, the minor compiler version, and then rotates the combination of those two values by the number of times the product had been used. Well, the result is truncated to 32-bit and then used as that magic 137 value from the beginning on. Yeah, now if we look at this and step back and think about it a second, then we might find that this is actually a very poor choice for a checksum function. Why is this so? Well, the point is that rotating a 4-byte string by something that is bigger than 32 bits, or 32, is effectively a knob. So rotating by 32 bits is like rotating nothing, right? So all count values above 32, let's say 5-bit value, are actually completely congruent to anything below 32. So at this part, you can see that out of the 32 bits that are there in the count field, only the lowest 5 are actually checked, leaving 27 open. So if you do the math, 27 plus the other 32 bits, then we see that only 37 out of 64 bits per comp ID struct are checked by the checksum function, which is kind of strange if this should be a checksum. All right, so we now spoke a little bit about the contents of the rich header. I tried to explain you how the checksum is built up. The last question I would like to answer is who actually builds up the rich header, and this is also, well, no black magic here. The Microsoft backend compiler puts a comp ID per object during compilation, and link.exe collects them together, such that all objects that are contained in one executable, well, are then put into the rich header. One exception is there, though. These are statically linked libraries, .lib. As these can contain multiple objects, they also contain multiple comp IDs, but in practice that doesn't make much of a difference because link.exe will just, well, sort them out and add them to the header. All right, and that was a technical dive through the rich header, and now I hand it back to George with statistics.
All right, so we kind of understand what the rich header does, but that doesn't really help us for triage. So what does this mean? How do we start to put it together, and how do we start to take advantage of it? And that's what I'm going to kind of go into right now. So the first thing is I'm going to talk a little bit about statistics. So the rich header is very specific to Microsoft. And we know that pretty much malicious files, they love to try to obfuscate themselves and hide themselves. So how prevalent is this going to be? Because that data is valuable, so if they know about it, they should hide it. So we took about 1 million samples and we ran it through the parsers. And we found that it's actually quite prevalent. 71% of all of our samples actually did contain a rich header. This was much higher than our assumption was initially, so that was pretty fantastic. Way more prevalent than we thought. Our next assumption was, well, you know, some of your more sophisticated actors, they probably at least strip it out. So we looked at APT1. We had a couple thousand samples. Actually, it's 298 samples for APT1. We said, how often do they strip it out? How much do they have? And it's 98% of all APT1 samples that we have actually contain the rich header. So that's pretty cool. We know sophisticated actors aren't dealing with it. So we said, what about you know, some more criminal stuff, some common criminal stuff? So we looked at Zeus Citadel. We saw for rich header, it's 37%. It's still a decent number, especially for triage, but we're starting to see that something's different, something's weird. But everything's not glorious in this case, because we have 71% for random, which is fantastic, 98 for APT1, which is fantastic, but we got 37 for Zeus. This brings us to the next point, is that when we look at the Metis malware sample set, we only had 2% had the rich header. I'm going to go in a little bit of the reasons why, but 71% is pretty fantastic. But this means that rich header is not a sure shot, and I did want to caveat with that while it is good, it's going to help you a lot with triage, and we're going to do some cool stuff with it. You got to be really careful when you use it, because not everything is going to contain it. And the reason it doesn't contain it, it really comes down to the Microsoft linker. Since the Microsoft linkers built it, there's really no documentation for it. There's no real expectation that other people are going to do it. So when malware doesn't have the rich header, you pretty much have a good assumption right now that it's using those basically built by .NET, Mini GW, GCC, or also a packer like dup. that pretty much is going to be stripping out the rich header because it's not going to include it in the first place. However, if we look at what actually includes the rich header, we see we got Visual Studios. What's interesting is some partners such as Intel's compiler actually does include the rich header as well. We don't know if that includes the linker in it or if they just actually built it because they're partners, no idea. But the three things that are really cool here is packers like UPX, ASPack, and also Nullsoft. They actually do keep the rich header in there, but they kind of distort it ever so slightly, which really becomes quite fantastic. So what? And once you have this information, we know it's pretty prevalent. It's got some interesting stuff. Let's actually see what we can do with it and how it can really help with the triage. So the first is that the rich header is really, really quite valuable in the sense that it's informative. You can start to figure out how the binary is actually built, and it's got tons of fun stuff. We're going to ignore that starting point from now for the reverse engineering side, but we're only going to talk about the triage. So the first part is discrepancies are absolutely fantastic. When we actually look at it, if the checksum is corrupt, that's pretty much a guarantee right now that the binary was post-modified, because people don't forget, they just forget about the rich header. So they're not trying to fix that checksum. So if you see the checksum corrupt, pretty much a guarantee the binary was post-modified. The second part is duplicate entries. Those three packers I talked, all of them do this. When they actually pack the binaries together, you see a product ID, you see a version information, and you see a count. And you actually see duplicate entries in there. There's no reason the Microsoft linker is going to put duplicate entries in there. So it's almost a guarantee that that binary was now packed. And the next aspect is to check this rich header, to start parsing it and looking at it together. It's incredibly fast. It's really inefficient. It's really cheap. It makes life pretty fun for us. But can we do more? There's a lot of information in there, and that's what we're going to start talking about now. So when we looked at it, we wanted to see if we could do some machine learning, some deep learning fun stuff, and actually create an algorithm that was incredibly fast, see if we could do it in near real time. We wanted to do similarity matching upon millions and millions of binaries, because we deal with millions of binaries on a daily basis. And we also had interesting stuff with the version information, and we wanted to see if that could fingerprint the actors. And when I say actors, I'm really talking about build environments. There is a discrepancy. It's not a direct correlation, but there is some correlation there. I can tell you what machine that malware was built on. So could we actually do it? The answer is yes, and we're going to go into how we did it now. The first thing is the rich header data is incredibly sparse. From a machine learning perspective, that's not really great. So we needed to fix that. And what we did, we used a deep learning technique called a stacked autoencoder. And I'm not going to get into the math, but we'll look at Mario right now. So all it really does is take this really cool picture of Mario, and it puts it to a denser, lower dimensional space. And that's the two-dimensional picture of Mario. And that's really all we need to know. What benefits us is it gives us a little bit cleaner results, and it's incredibly memory efficient. So instead of dealing with millions upon millions of samples, needing gigs and gigs of RAM, all of a sudden I don't need a server, I can actually do this on our algorithm. And when I actually showed the demonstrations, this was all recorded with just a silly laptop. So the next part is once I have it now in a dimensional space, I can really start to work with and start to take care of it. We wanted to do actually the similarity matching aspect of it. And we chose KNN, and we chose ball tree. And to talk about the KNN is a great algorithm for similarity matching. It doesn't really require much pre-processing. It's pretty easy to work with. But the really key aspect here is I don't need to predefine my buckets, my groups. Some of the other matching algorithms out there, you have to say, okay, I got 100 buckets, I got 200 buckets. Well, I have no idea how many buckets I have in a couple million malware samples. KNN is going to figure it out for me, and that's really what I want. The next is that with the ball tree is it allows really, really rapid lookups. So these numbers were all recorded on a laptop, and we got 6.73 milliseconds. So that's pretty good. So on my silly laptop, it's about 3 years old Mac. It's not really great. I can throw in a hash in there, spit out results in about 6.73 milliseconds for all the similar malware I have. What's also in this ball tree, we did a static ball tree, but ball tree is great to work with. It's pretty nice. You could actually turn this into a real-time system where you actually are doing it on the fly as well. So to actually show you what the training thing is, we have a quick little demonstration. So you guys know this is going to be fully trained across a couple million samples. So the first is I'm going to take it, and what's really going on here is I'm loading TensorFlow. All that's happening, wonderful thing, TensorFlow is loading up. And it's a little bit slow. So here's where the magic happens. What's going on is it's taking all that data and it's going to start constructing into a lower dimensional space. And this is real-time training. I'm not speeding it up. This is accurate. On average, it's about 6 seconds or so. So I'm training all of my information, putting into the space I want, and kind of getting my ball tree in order. So there it's done. It's now a lower dimensional space. I can actually start working with it. I'm pretty happy, and it's creating my ball tree. So I think that was about 1 million samples, might have been about 2 million. Everything's already trained. So the next is we want to do a lookup. So when I say it's really fast, so I pretty much have everything ready to go. It's got my SHA, pretty much pressed play. And there you go. I got my JSON output of all my similar samples. And it makes no difference if I'm telling it to spit out 10 samples, telling it to spit out 100 samples, telling it to spit out 200 samples. It's pretty much about the same amount of time, which is pretty fantastic in my opinion. But we're dealing with JSON. And JSON's great, but I don't know about you guys, I need pretty pictures. So from the picture perspective, we look at what that JSON's doing is, I'm not really clustering because it's technically not a clustering, but I'm putting them in little buckets here. So we have nearest neighbor 1, and we go all the way to nearest neighbor 10 on this. We have much more. And within those buckets, we have correlations of different samples. From the distance metric, we can see that all of these samples in these different buckets are all actually really quite similar. And we're going to start to dive into that and go into a couple different case studies to explain what's actually in there and why this gets really, really cool. So the first case study we want to look at is APT1. So we took a random SHA and we said, let's run this through the algorithm and see what I have. What was interesting in all these results, all the AV signatures were different. They're all for the most part generic, but they're all different generic signatures. So the first one is we saw a direct correlation between another sample set that we had. And this is only about 290 samples we're looking at just in this group. We found another sample. The rich header was identical. What this means, when we started to reverse engineer it and look at it, we found that the code actually was identical, like identical code base. Of course, that means we have identical functionality. The difference in the SHA was actually just because of a compiler artifact. So then we looked at our next bucket, and we see 3 other samples. And the first is we're looking at basically a different version of APT1. So the version information is slightly off, so slightly different build environment. We also see an introduction of a new function called flush file buffers. And what's happening is APT1 kind of had a little bit of bug, not really a bug, it's kind of a bad performance technique they're using, where they're taking their information in their buffer, and they're writing it to disk. When they wrote it to disk, they then opened that file again, added their escape characters, and then did another write. So while the introduction of this flush file buffers, what it's really doing is it takes the information while it's still in its buffer, it adds the string cat function, finishes everything, and then writes it to disk. So instead of 2 writes, we got 1, which is kind of nice. Now I know that we have, everything was pretty much what we expected with the similarity matching algorithm. We did actually have matches for APT1. So then we looked at Zeus. We took another random sample, threw it in our system, and we said, okay, let's see what it can do. The first is we had another identical matching, 23 samples that were identical rich header. We started to reverse engineer it and take these all apart to see why is it, like, what's the difference of this? Why do they have different hashes? And pretty much all the difference was you see an optimization between a do while and a for loop. And we also see that code segments were reorganized. So all practical purposes, that's the exact same version of Zeus, same malware variant, it's all the same. We looked at the next bucket then, and we detected 4 samples. This is pretty much a different version, which is exactly what we're expecting here, is we're seeing an XOR algorithm, kind of an improvement of Zeus, where we're seeing the XOR algorithm looped 8 times more. But this is where it gets kind of fun, because we then put back our 1 million sample set. And we said, how is this across a larger scale? What can we actually see? So in this, we threw another sample, Zeus, and we detected 36,606 samples. We've started to reverse engineer it. We automated this process with IDA Pro because no one's going to reverse 36,000 samples. If they are, they need friends. But we're seeing that there's pretty much identical functionality going on here. The only difference that we could observe across these samples was different, a constant value is changing slightly. Now, where it gets really fun is we threw all these samples into VirusTotal, and 16,123 of these samples had no VirusTotal signature whatsoever across any of them. So VirusTotal is saying these are completely benign. Our similarity matching algorithm saying, hey, it's not benign, it's got pretty much a direct one-to-one correlation to the sample you initially threw in. Of the ones that were detected, they're usually generic, they were mislabeled, something was off about the signature. So that's pretty cool, I'm pretty happy. The next is we went through our next bucket, and we saw that we had 1,567 samples. So that's pretty cool, but something was slightly off, so we looked into why was the rich header off. And the answer here was actually a different build environment. So all the samples were identical in the sense of functionality. We just had slightly different variations in the version information, which tells us that machine was either upgraded, they upgraded their libraries, it was built on a different machine, or someone else entirely actually built it. Furthermore, 511 of these samples, again, had no signature detection whatsoever in VirusTotal. So that's pretty cool. So we looked at the validation, and whenever you try to validate anything on millions of samples, it becomes a huge challenge, especially when there's really nothing else to compare and contrast it to. So we looked at this and we said, all right, let's correlate IDA Pro generated code. And so we ran that through it, automated across 1 million samples, and we wanted to get the entropy of the source code and the differentials, along with the entropy of the source code and the differentials for the rich header. What we see, it's a pretty heat map, which is why I selected this one for the validation, but we see a tight little cluster in the bottom left. That's exactly what we want to see from a machine learning perspective to say, hey, it actually is doing similarity matching. There is a direct correlation. If this was bad, you'd see dots all over the place. And I hate when I see dots all over the place. This is good. So in conclusion, we want to kind of wrap this up a little bit and explain stuff. And then we love questions, so please ask us questions on it. We have tons of stuff we would like to talk about, but yeah, conclusion time. The first we really wanted to emphasize here is the rich header is really valuable for triage, and it's really important to look at this from a future work perspective. And work really needs to be had on this. The first is the product ID. Like, what are these true mappings? I mean, I can tell you right now from the builder and the compilation standpoint of how these are created, but we see tons of stuff that are unique. They seem to be really, really constant. What is that mapping thing? There's no way I can tell you because I'm not Microsoft, but it does allow my similarity matching algorithm to work, so I'm happy, but I really want to know what that is. The next is the checksum. Microsoft's not dumb. Why is it so poor? I think that would be really nice to figure out. What was the reason? Was it just done in '98 and they just forgot about it? Possibly. I don't know. And the purpose. Microsoft has been very, very secretive about this. Every time we've talked to them, even from our friends at Microsoft, they all get excited and start talking to us, and then immediately it's just radio silence. And we don't hear from them for like 2 months, which is kind of interesting. So why are they so secretive? Like, what is the original purpose? Are they doing something fun with it, or is it just basically they're saying, hey, we're using this basically to triage our bug fixes and putting it to our partners? That's probably my assessment. I have no idea. I'd love to know. The next aspect is really from our similarity matching perspective. We focused from an academic perspective on what is a similarity matching just for the rich header, and we only included that. If you actually want to use this in practice, you should include other features as well. You probably are going to get something that's pretty nice. So we also, every single thing that we found on the rich header was there's discrepancies in there, things were missed, stuff wasn't really that good. So what we decided to do was go ahead and give you guys our extractor. We licensed it under Apache 2. We created a Docker service for it, and it's ready to use in our Home system. And Homes, if you're familiar with Crits or Viper, it's basically something that we've developed similar vein, but we use it for millions upon millions of samples, distributed large-scale stuff. So you can access it from homesprocessing.github.io, and I'll put that out probably sometime this weekend, depending how good my internet connection is. So the takeaways for this talk, and what I really want to leave you guys with, is the rich header is really, really valuable for triage. It allows you to do quick detection. I can identify packed and post-modified binaries pretty much in like instant real time, and it's really cheap. The next is allows me to do similarity matching. So if you give me one sample, I can look across everything from a historic perspective in near real time. And it's very efficient. I can use my laptop to do it. And the third is the build environment fingerprinting. And this is a pretty interesting aspect. I'm not going to say it's going to tell you where, like, who the different actors are, but it's giving you a data point that allows you to start putting analysis together and start figuring that out. Additionally, we like Happy Julian. And to get Happy Julian, if you guys have C2 DLLs, CVTs, link.exe, or MLEXEs, please send them to Julian so we can start to map everything out, because everyone wants a Happy Julian. And the next is, this was quite an endeavor to kind of put everything together. So I wanted to give some shouts out to say thank you to the guys that assisted. And I'm George Webster, and this is Julian Kirsch, and we're at the Technical University of Munich. If you guys have any questions, I think we have to go to the speaker area. We'd love to talk to you more about it. Thank you.